I'm going to tell you a story. It was a hot May day when I arrived at the meeting spot. 10 minutes later, the junction was packed with over 200 people, gay men from Europe and the Americas, wearing tan tops or t-shirts, shorts, slippers, or sneakers. Yoav, the CEO of the tourism company, was there too, making sure all was set. Along with about 50 tourists, I went on the bus, headed for Masada and the Dead Sea. Then, 3 Israelis joined us, the tour guide, a locally well-known drag queen, and a cameraman. Except for me, only 2 other women joined the tour, a sister and a friend of 2 of the gay tourists. Everyone was sleepy after a long night of partying, alcohol, and what they called vitamins. So this paper explores the relationship of body and politics in gay tourism to Israeli heritage sites. Promotion of gay tourism to Israel is commonly accused of pinkwashing, which refers to the inclusion of LGBTs into the nation, painting the state as a liberal and democratic, while legitimizing violent policies towards countries and communities portrayed as less tolerant to LGBTs. Pinkwashing contributes to a logic that contrasts Israel with the Middle East, mainly by presenting Tel Aviv as a liberal gay haven. This research is part of a larger ethnographic project on gay tourism to Israel, and since I don't have enough time, I'm going to skip the literature and the method parts, but if you have questions, I'll be happy to answer in the Q&A. So back to the tour. While we were on the highway to Jerusalem, the tour guide began to provide a short history of Zionism, with emphasis on the 1948 war. Passing by the separation wall, the guide described it as justified by both the Zionist logic and security threats. He pointed to the difference in legal status between areas A, B, and C, specifically stressing the need not to accidentally enter dangerous zones where Palestinians are liable to attack you. Conversely, he added that as a Jewish man, he could easily pass through the checkpoints into Israel. Immediately after framing whatever lay behind the wall as dangerous, backward, and uninteresting, the guide recommended that the tourists visit the city of Ramallah, located deep in Area A. He was implying that, unlike himself, tourists with foreign passports were allowed to enter the areas controlled by Palestinian Authority, and that they should take advantage of that to explore parts of Israel. Following his recommendation, the guide turned to Yoav, the CEO, to ask if he thought Ramallah was safe for gays. This question was never answered. While the guide's question suggested a mode of normalization of the Israeli occupation, the fact that it remained unanswered revealed the implied danger to LGBT individuals and traditional culture, and highlighted, by way of contradiction, the framing of Tel Aviv as a liberal island. As the bus went downhill to Masada, the guide provided a detailed explanation of what an Israeli Jewish settlement was. Imagine young and beautiful people holding an Uzi rifle, living in a suburb. Yes, it's called a settlement, but actually it's just like a suburb. Meanwhile, as we saw Ma'ale Adumim at the window, the guide pointed to the large settlement, emphasizing that life there is the same as any other place, no different from other Western suburbs or villages. A few minutes later, he asked everyone to pay attention to settlements on our left, built about 10 years ago on land that belongs to nobody. He went on to explain, today, everyone wants to control this space, and there is no right way to decide who the owner is. So each side takes action and builds settlements and claims that it's their land, and that's how it is for both sides, Israel and the Arabs. Contrary to a leftist view, which would highlight the ongoing expropriation of private Palestinian land by Jewish settlers, this perspective views the government-financed settlements of the occupied territories as a human right stemming from the belief that the land inherently belongs to the Jewish people and thus to the Israeli state. The explanation was twofold. The tour guide both normalized the occupation and accentuated that Israel had the right to the land since it was no man's land in an Israeli sovereign state, which such discourse made the settlement seem legitimate rather than controversial, let alone immoral. I'd expected the tour guide to provide a more complex narrative regarding the conflict. However, he constructed a political narrative in tandem with state agendas and wider pinkwashing initiatives. I'd also hoped the tourists would object to this narrative. I was not sure whether it was that they were still sleeping off their alcohol and vitamins and were not interested, or too little aware of regional politics to imagine this could be a controversial political issue rather than geohistorical facts. Maybe they were just being polite. The guy didn't stop there, but delved into the exotic details of how to establish a settlement. So it must be a foggy night. You bring a caravan at night, use a semi-trailer to bring it up, and you bring a power generator. The legitimacy comes from the Ottoman law. According to the Ottoman law, if you have a roof over your head, you can't be displaced. So you bring a caravan, it has a roof, and you immediately put some potted plants near the door and hang a cloth line. Then the police come. And they can't make you leave, so they take you to court, and soon after a trial begins. Sometimes they make you leave, if it's private Palestinian land, for example. They will take you off the ground. But if it's state land, then they can't make you leave. So this provided the gay tourists tool for understanding the legal nuances behind settlements, portraying Israel as a law-abiding state. The guide was not only presenting a political discourse, but rather introducing the logic behind the gray areas in land and settlement law in Palestinian territories, and the way settlers used them to their advantage, manipulating the willing government and the indifferent international community by creating facts on the ground without formal government approval. So minutes before stopping at the sea level lookout on the way down to the Dead Sea, the guide, who seemed to feel that he had gone too far, moderated his presentation, once again presenting the settlements not as a political movement, but rather as a cultural mode. Every settlement is different. Most of the settlements are not ideologically driven. There are some that are, but you'd have to go about 50 kilometers north to see them. Here it's mostly neoliberalism. You can see lots of villas and Toyotas, not caravans. What the guide implied was that the people who occupied the settlements along the road were there for the cheap cost of living, once again normalizing the situation and taking much of the politics out. He left the impression that the choice made by settlers were such that a reasonable person could identify with, in terms of cost-benefit logic. In the context of queer tourism, such practices are not commonly used since gay tourists are usually directed to Tel Aviv, nightlife, the beach, and are hardly ever exposed to the occupation of Palestine. Moreover, pinkwashing initiatives that are a larger part of what gay tourists are exposed to before arriving in Israel lead them to see Tel Aviv as a liberal island in a backward desert in the first place. Leaving Tel Aviv is thus an act of leaping into the unknown, one in which the occupation is bound to reveal itself and require explanation. Still, the references to the tourist sexuality that the guide made revealed not only that he was not accustomed to gay tourists, but also that even outside Tel Aviv, Israel was portrayed as a queer safe space, while Palestine was portrayed as an authentic place, consisting of tourist attractions, but at the same time as dangerous to gay tourists. The binary constructing pinkwashing logic was thus maintained. Arriving at the sea level lookout, a Bedouin man in traditional garb appeared, waiting for the tourists with a camel. The Bedouins are a marginalized community struggling with Israeli authorities for land, housing rights, infrastructures, and recognition as a colonized indigenous people. The tourists were lined up to wait for the camel ride, an experience portrayed as essential and must-do. Since there were about 50 of us, after the first few took a ride, Yoav insisted that it would be better if we do it in pairs. The first to do so were given a rainbow flag. The Bedouin started shouting at Yoav, who came to me and said in Hebrew so that the tourists wouldn't understand. He thought the Bedouin was he started shooting at him, and he thought the Bedouin was homophobic. Soon after, the second couple was given an Israeli flag as well. The Bedouin began shouting again. Yoav said that he thought the Bedouin hated Israel, and a loud argument ensued. Clearly, the situation was difficult for Yoav, as he felt he was facing an explosive mixture of anti-Zionism and homophobia. A few seconds into the argument, I realized that the Bedouin was opposed to the flag flying, not because of the symbolic meaning of the flag, but for safety reasons. If anyone fell off the camel because he held a flag in one hand, it would endanger his livelihood. Yoav reassured the tourists that all was fine. Yoav and I both agreed that a flag was risky, but he insisted that tourists continue to do so. Yoav's presumption that the Bedouin was homophobic signaled that in a desert space, one should expect prejudice. Thus, the camel ride signified a touristic experience opposite to being at a pride parade, one of an authentic and intolerant Middle East, reproducing once again the backward versus liberal space binary of pinkwashing. The heat was getting impossible. The tourists went back to the air-conditioned bus. We went up to Masada on the cable railway for a short tour. Since the Masada tour was the only walking experience that day, and since walking is considered an effective mode for extending political ideology within tourism, I anticipated the guide would use it to reinforce Zionist narrative he had earlier introduced. Our group stood out in many ways, performatively. Even though the tourists were dressed casually, they still looked well kept, more as if they were going to an after party than to a field trip. The gay tourists were less interested in exploring the site, but rather looked as if they were trying to be looked at. This was made clear when I checked the time, and I realized that the tour at the site itself lasted 20 minutes, while the collective photo op took almost 30, with more time spent on selfies, uploading, sharing on social media, etc. We drove to the Dead Sea. For lunch at a hotel, each tourist received a locker, key, a towel, a bag with local mud that is considered therapeutic. The temperature was 41 C, and almost everyone, including the drag queen, went into the water, later applying the mud and then going back into the water and to clean it off. The mudded bodies illustrated the centrality of the body, of beauty culture, of self-care within gay culture. This was what the tourists most wanted in that day tour. 3 hours later, most of the tourists were cooling off in the hotel swimming pool. The schedule of the trip revealed the tourists' priorities. They spent only about an hour on Masada, a landmark in the country's historical narrative, but over 4 hours at the beach. They were above all interested in sensual, haptic, embodied experiences. The body was signified in a performative way in the photos and the spectacle of gay tourists moving through Masada. Later, it was bodies immersed in the water, mudded, cleaned, cooled in the swimming pool. These experiences were declared by the tourists at the center of the tour, reflecting a gay touristic culture. That morning, when I first entered the bus, I sat next to Martin, a tall, blonde Swiss tourist visiting Israel for the first time. He told me that he came to Israel with a friend, but since his friend had already taken this day trip, he came alone. This made me realize that this kind of day tour outside Tel Aviv was considered a must. But why go on an all-gay tour? Why not join a cheaper day trip? It's extremely expensive. One reason was that the expectation for an embodied experience tailored for gay tourists, Martin and the others, did not strike me as people who had just met. Knowing that he came alone, I wondered how he made friends so quickly. When I asked him, he explained that he had met some of the group members the year before at the Barcelona Pride Parade. Like Martin, all the tourists came for the Tel Aviv Pride Parade. Many told me they had heard it was amazing. Since they knew I was not a tourist myself, they occasionally came up to me with questions revealing how little they knew about Israel. Many questions related to the parade. I was surprised at how little they were interested in the history of Masada or the geography of the Dead Sea. I expected questions on the Zionist narrative, religion, about the occupation, about gay rights in Israel, gay lives outside Tel Aviv, anything. Such questions were never asked. I watched the drag queen interview tourists about their experience in Israel. It was for a promotional clip. The answers referred to the sexy gay men in Tel Aviv, the Tel Aviv beach, how free and fun Tel Aviv was, you know, the theme, Tel Aviv, and the awesome parties they went to. Once again, all the roads led back to Tel Aviv, even when standing at the foot of Masada or covered by Dead Sea, in Dead Sea mud. Just like the haptic experience that did not resonate the political discourse that was broadcast throughout the day, the notion of Tel Aviv was disconnected from its broader Israeli context, including the local LGBT politics. Politics of all kinds was marginalized as the body took center stage. So, to conclude, this paper showed that the movement of gay bodies in and out of heritage sites intensifies the coupling of gay bodies and sensual modes, forming an experience dissociated from contentious politics and political narratives and the geographical location. When performed in Israel, such practices reveal how the tourists participate in haptic experience, do not counter, nor do they embrace, the political narrative. That is, sensual performances are not applied in order to make sense of a place, narrative, politics, or heritage. Rather, sensual enjoyment is in itself a mode of gay tourism. While in Tel Aviv, politics was virtually invisible among the parade and party crowds, outside it was camouflaged under a deep layer of mud and over a sensuous body. Whether putting the spotlight on sensual joy queers dominant discourses of tourism, and whether it promotes queering heritage sites is yet to be determined. Thank you.